The cool night breeze rustled through the trees as Officer Mitchell drove down the quiet streets of Cedar Grove. The clock on his dashboard showed 11:47 p.m., and he was just thinking about grabbing a coffee when something caught his eye. A dark blue pickup truck rolled past, its right taillight completely busted. Under normal circumstances, this would have been a routine stop, write a quick ticket and send the driver on their way. But something felt different about tonight. Mitchell flipped on his patrol car's lights, and the pickup truck pulled over smoothly onto the shoulder of Pine Road. The street was deserted at this hour, with only the occasional moth dancing around the streetlights. As Mitchell stepped out of his cruiser, he noticed how the truck's suspension was practically touching the ground, like it was carrying something extremely heavy. "Dispatch, I'm conducting a traffic stop on Pine Road, dark blue Ford F-150, license plate." Mitchell spoke into his radio, following procedure. The dispatcher's crackly voice confirmed his location, but mentioned the nearest backup was at least 15 minutes away if needed. Mitchell wasn't worried. He'd handled countless traffic stops in his 8 years on the force. Walking up to the truck, Mitchell's boots crunched on loose gravel. His flashlight beam revealed windows tinted so dark they looked almost black. That was strike two, definitely over the legal limit. He tapped on the driver's window with his knuckles, but there was no response, just silence. "Driver, roll down your window," Mitchell called out, his voice firm but professional. Still nothing. The engine hummed quietly, and Mitchell could feel slight vibrations through the truck's body. Someone was definitely inside, but they weren't making any move to acknowledge him. Mitchell's hand instinctively moved to rest on his holster. It wasn't fear, more like the caution that comes from experience. He'd seen too many routine stops go sideways to take chances. "Last warning, roll down the window now," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of authority. The truck just sat there like a sleeping giant. Mitchell's flashlight beam caught something moving inside, but the tint made it impossible to make out details. His heart rate picked up slightly. In a small town like Cedar Grove, most traffic stops involved locals heading home late or teenagers out past curfew. This felt different. He reached for his radio again. "Dispatch, requesting that backup to step it up. Something's not right here." The words had barely left his mouth when he heard it, a low groan of metal as the driver's door began to open. Mitchell took 2 quick steps back, creating distance. The door swung wide, and that's when things got really interesting. The truck's suspension creaked loudly, rising up several inches as weight shifted inside. A massive hand appeared on the doorframe, so big it could probably palm a basketball with ease. Mitchell's flashlight beam caught glimpses of movement, and he felt his mouth go dry as a figure began to emerge from the truck. Time seemed to slow down. Mitchell had dealt with all sorts of people in his career: angry drunks, scared teenagers, argumentative business people. But nothing in his training had prepared him for what was about to step out of that truck. The night was about to take a turn that would change everything, not just for Officer Mitchell, but for the entire town of Cedar Grove. Standing there on Pine Road, with only his flashlight and training to rely on, Mitchell was about to learn a valuable lesson about assumptions. The figure emerging from that truck would shatter every preconception he had about this traffic stop, and, in the process, spark a chain of events that would be talked about in Cedar Grove for years to come. The air felt electric with tension as the driver continued to exit the vehicle. Mitchell's flashlight beam trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer anticipation of what was about to happen next. In all his years of service, he'd never quite experienced a moment quite like this one, and deep down, he knew this routine traffic stop was about to become anything but routine. The figure that emerged from the truck seemed to keep rising and rising, like a mountain taking human form. Officer Mitchell's flashlight beam, which had been steady throughout countless traffic stops, now shook slightly as it illuminated what had to be the biggest person he'd ever encountered in his life. The man had to duck to clear the truck's roof, and when he straightened to his full height, he seemed to block out the streetlight behind him. Mitchell felt his throat go dry. His training had taught him to maintain control of every situation, but right now, he felt about as in control as a leaf in a hurricane. The giant before him was easily over 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that looked wide enough to fill a doorway. Even in the dim light, Mitchell could see the man's arms were thicker than his own legs. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them," Mitchell managed to say, his voice somehow staying professional despite his racing heart. The giant slowly raised his hands, and they looked like they could grab a basketball in each palm. Mitchell's mind raced through his options. His backup was still at least 10 minutes away, and his tactical training seemed woefully inadequate for someone of this size. The giant spoke, and his voice was surprisingly gentle, though it carried the kind of deep rumble you'd expect from someone his size. "Officer, I know my window tint's dark, and I apologize for not rolling it down. The motor's been acting up since yesterday." The words were polite, measured, but Mitchell wasn't ready to let his guard down just yet. "Step away from the vehicle," Mitchell ordered, trying to maintain authority in his voice. The giant complied, each step making the gravel crunch loudly under his heavy work boots. Mitchell's flashlight revealed more details now. The man was wearing what looked like coaching gear, with a whistle hanging around his neck on a lanyard. "I'm reaching for my wallet," the giant announced carefully, moving his hand slowly toward his back pocket. Mitchell tensed, but nodded. Everything about this stop felt surreal, like he'd stumbled into a scene from a movie. The wallet the man produced looked tiny in his massive hands, like a child's toy. As Mitchell checked the license, his radio crackled to life. "Unit 247, backup is 5 minutes out. Do you copy?" The giant didn't react to the news of backup, which Mitchell noted. Usually, people got nervous when they heard more officers were coming. This man seemed completely at ease. "You're the new youth football coach," Mitchell said suddenly, recognition dawning as he read the name on the license. The giant nodded, a warm smile spreading across his face that transformed his intimidating appearance into something much more approachable. "Started 3 months ago at the community center," he confirmed. Mitchell's training was telling him to maintain his professional distance, but his instincts were saying something else entirely. The giant reached back into the truck, moving slowly and deliberately, and pulled out a clipboard full of papers. "I was just heading home from an emergency meeting. Some kids vandalized the center tonight, broke a bunch of windows and my truck's taillight too. I've got the incident report right here." The tension in Mitchell's shoulders began to ease slightly, but years of experience kept him alert. He'd learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. Still, something about the giant's calm demeanor and the way he handled himself spoke volumes. This wasn't some troublemaker, this was someone who commanded respect not through intimidation, but through presence. "Would you mind if I took a look at the damage?" Mitchell asked, his cop instincts still active but now mixed with genuine curiosity. The giant nodded and led him around to the back of the truck. Sure enough, the taillight was smashed, with clear signs of vandalism. Small shards of red plastic littered the ground, catching the beam of Mitchell's flashlight like tiny rubies. In the distance, Mitchell could hear the approaching sirens of his backup, but the sound didn't seem as urgent anymore. The night had taken an unexpected turn, and what had started as a tense confrontation was evolving into something very different. As they stood there examining the damage, Mitchell couldn't help but think about how quickly situations could change, how first impressions could be so dramatically wrong. The giant was explaining his plans to fix the taillight first thing in the morning, his deep voice carrying naturally in the quiet night air. Mitchell found himself nodding along, already thinking about how this encounter might lead to something bigger than a simple traffic stop. In Cedar Grove, where community meant everything, sometimes the most meaningful connections started in the most unexpected ways. As backup arrived with flashing lights painting the scene in red and blue, Mitchell realized this night would be remembered not for what could have gone wrong, but for what was about to go right. The story of the cop and the giant was just beginning, and Cedar Grove would never be quite the same. As the backup patrol cars pulled up with their lights flashing, Officer Mitchell found himself in an unusual position. Instead of tensely managing a situation, he was listening intently as the gentle giant described the vandalism at the youth center. The two other officers approached cautiously, hands near their holsters, but Mitchell waved them off with a reassuring gesture. "You guys aren't going to believe this," Mitchell called out to his colleagues. "Remember hearing about the new football coach everyone's been talking about? Well, I just met him." The giant gave a friendly wave to the other officers, and even in the mix of red and blue emergency lights, they could see him crack a warm smile. The giant reached into his truck again, this time pulling out his phone. "I've got pictures of all the damage at the center," he said, his deep voice carrying across the quiet street. "These kids didn't just break windows, they sprayed graffiti all over the walls we just painted last weekend. The walls the kids in my program helped paint." There was genuine sadness in his voice, not anger. Mitchell and his fellow officers gathered around the phone, looking at the images. The community center, which had been a source of pride just yesterday, now bore ugly scars of senseless destruction. But what caught Mitchell's attention wasn't just the damage, it was how the giant's hands shook slightly as he swiped through the photos. This wasn't just property damage to him, it was personal. "The worst part isn't the broken windows or my taillight," the giant continued, putting his phone away. "It's what this will do to the kids. Some of them come from rough homes, you know. The center is their safe place. Tomorrow morning, they're going to see this and," he trailed off, shaking his head. One of the backup officers, who'd been quiet until now, stepped forward. "My nephew goes to your football program," he said. "He hasn't stopped talking about it for weeks, says it's the best thing that's ever happened to him." The giant's face lit up with recognition, and suddenly the mood shifted. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore, it was becoming a community moment. Mitchell made a decision right there. "Look," he said, pulling out his notepad. "We need to document this properly. The taillight, the center, all of it. But then I've got an idea." The other officers looked at him curiously. They knew that tone in Mitchell's voice. It meant he was cooking up something good. The giant listened as Mitchell laid out his thoughts. The police department had been looking for ways to connect better with the community, especially the youth. This vandalism, as terrible as it was, might be an opportunity. Instead of just filing a report and moving on, why not turn this into something positive? "What if we helped rebuild?" Mitchell suggested. "Not just the center, but trust too. Show these kids that police officers aren't just about arrests and tickets. We could work together, make something good come out of this mess." The giant's eyes lit up, and even in the darkness, you could see the wheels turning in his head. The conversation that followed was unlike any other traffic stop in Cedar Grove's history. Four men, standing in the glow of police lights, planning not an arrest but a renaissance. The giant shared stories about the kids in his program, their dreams, their struggles, their potential. The officers contributed ideas about community involvement and police youth programs they'd seen work in other towns. Time seemed to fly by as they talked. The midnight hour came and went, but nobody noticed. This wasn't about a broken taillight anymore. This was about building bridges, about turning an accidental meeting into something meaningful. The giant's presence, which had initially seemed threatening, now felt like a blessing, like the universe had arranged this exact moment for a reason. As they wrapped up their impromptu meeting, Mitchell pulled out his ticket book. The giant watched, still smiling, as Mitchell wrote something down. But instead of a citation, Mitchell was writing his personal cell phone number. "Call me tomorrow," he said, tearing off the page. "Let's make this happen." The giant carefully folded the paper in his massive hands, treating it like something precious. "You know," he said, looking at the officers, "when I saw those lights in my mirror tonight, I never thought it would lead to this. Sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected moments." As the giant climbed back into his truck, making it sink noticeably on its suspension, Mitchell couldn't help but smile. Tomorrow, they would deal with the vandalism, the reports, and all the official business. But tonight, something special had happened on this quiet street in Cedar Grove. A routine traffic stop had transformed into the beginning of something much bigger, something that would touch lives far beyond this moment. The next morning, word spread through Cedar Grove like wildfire. People at the local diner couldn't stop talking about how Officer Mitchell had pulled over the town's famous new football coach. But the story they shared wasn't about conflict, it was about connection. The giant's truck was parked outside the community center, its broken taillight a reminder of last night's events, but what was happening inside was something special. Mitchell pulled up to the center just as the sun was climbing over the trees. He'd barely slept, his mind too full of plans and possibilities. The giant was already there, his massive frame somehow looking even bigger in the morning light as he swept up broken glass from the sidewalk. But he wasn't alone. 3 other police officers had shown up early, working alongside him. "I didn't expect to see you here so soon," the giant called out, his deep voice carrying across the parking lot. Mitchell grabbed a broom from his patrol car's trunk. He'd come prepared. "Couldn't let you have all the fun," he replied with a grin. The morning air was crisp, filled with purpose and possibility. As they worked, more people started showing up. Word had gotten around fast in their small town. Parents whose kids attended the football program arrived with coffee and donuts. Local business owners stopped by with offers to help replace the broken windows. Even the mayor made an appearance, clearly impressed by the spontaneous community response. The Giant shared stories as they worked, telling Mitchell about the kids in his program. There was the quiet boy who'd found his voice on the field, the siblings who'd never played sports before but were now team leaders, and dozens more stories of transformation. Each tale made the vandalism feel more personal, but also made their work more meaningful. "You know what's funny?" the Giant said, pausing to wipe sweat from his forehead. "Last night, when I saw your lights in my mirror, I thought it was going to be the worst end to an already bad day. Now look at all this." He gestured at the growing crowd of volunteers, all working together to restore the center. Mitchell understood exactly what he meant. The center was coming back to life before their eyes, but something even more important was happening. Barriers were breaking down. People who might never have spoken to each other were working side by side, sharing laughs and stories. The division between police and community was fading with every passing hour. Around mid-morning, the first kids started showing up for their regular football practice. Their faces fell when they saw the damage, but then lit up with amazement at the scene before them. Their coach, the Giant they all looked up to, was working alongside police officers, parents, and neighbors to fix their special place. One small boy approached Mitchell, eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you really a police officer?" he asked, staring at Mitchell's uniform. "Can I help too?" Mitchell handed him a small brush and showed him how to safely clean up some paint spots. Soon more kids joined in, eager to be part of the restoration effort. The Giant watched this unfold with pride shining in his eyes. He pulled Mitchell aside, his voice thick with emotion. "See that kid over there?" He pointed to the boy Mitchell had given the brush to. 3 months ago, he was terrified of police officers. Now look at him. The boy was chatting happily with another officer, showing him the best way to scrub off graffiti. As the morning wore on, the transformation was incredible. Windows were replaced, walls were repainted, and the graffiti disappeared. But the physical changes weren't what mattered most. It was the conversations happening, the friendships forming, the trust building between people who might have never connected otherwise. Local news crews showed up, drawn by the story of how a late-night traffic stop had turned into something remarkable. They wanted interviews, but both Mitchell and the Giant were too busy working to stop. This wasn't about publicity. It was about community, about showing what could happen when people came together instead of pulling apart. By early afternoon, the community center looked better than ever. Fresh paint gleamed in the sunlight, new windows sparkled, and the parking lot was spotless. But the real masterpiece wasn't the building, it was the bonds that had formed, the barriers that had crumbled, the understanding that had grown between different parts of their community. Mitchell looked at his watch, realizing he'd been there for hours past his shift. But as he watched kids playing with police officers, parents chatting with neighbors they'd never spoken to before, and his Giant friend beaming with pride, he knew this was exactly where he needed to be. Sometimes the best police work happened without a single arrest or ticket. Sometimes it was just about being part of something bigger than yourself. The weeks following that transformative day at the community center brought changes nobody could have predicted. What started as a simple traffic stop had sparked something remarkable in Cedar Grove. The Giant's broken taillight had been fixed long ago, but the connections formed that night were still growing stronger. Officer Mitchell found himself spending more and more time at the center, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. He'd show up after his shifts, still in uniform, and kids who once would have run from a police car now ran toward him with excitement. The Giant had given him an unofficial title, assistant coach, though Mitchell's football knowledge was limited to what he'd learned watching games on TV. "You don't need to know all the plays," the Giant had told him with a laugh that shook the windows. "These kids just need someone to believe in them." And he was right. Mitchell discovered that his presence alone made a difference. Some of the kids started opening up to him about problems at home or at school, trusting him not just as a police officer, but as a friend. The Giants' football program had grown too. Word had spread about how the community had come together after the vandalism, and now parents from neighboring towns were bringing their kids to join. The sight of the giant coaching alongside police officers had become normal, but it never stopped being special. One particularly memorable afternoon, Mitchell arrived to find the giant teaching a group of kids about more than just football. "Sometimes life hits you hard," he was saying, his deep voice gentle but firm. "But it's not about how hard you get hit, it's about how you get back up." The kids hum on every word, and Mitchell realized they weren't just learning about sports. They were learning about life. The other officers had gotten involved too. What started as a few volunteers had turned into an official community outreach program. Officers would take turns visiting the center, sharing their experiences, and more importantly, listening to the kids' stories. The walls between law enforcement and the community were coming down, one conversation at a time. Even the kids who'd vandalized the center ended up being part of the story's silver lining. They'd been caught eventually, not through traditional police work, but because they turned themselves in. The giant's influence in the community had reached them too, and instead of facing harsh punishments, they were now regular volunteers at the center, learning firsthand about responsibility and redemption. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story about the changes in Cedar Grove. They wanted to interview Mitchell about his role in it all, but he redirected them to the giant. "Talk to the real hero," he'd said. But the giant had just smiled and shook his head. "Heroes don't work alone," he replied, his massive hand resting gently on Mitchell's shoulder. "This is about all of us." The center had become more than just a place for football. Other programs started popping up: homework help, mentoring sessions, family movie nights. Officers would often bring their own families, breaking down the perception that police were somehow separate from the community they served. The giant's vision had expanded far beyond sports, touching lives in ways nobody had expected. One evening, as Mitchell watched the giant running drills with a new group of kids, he thought back to that night with the broken taillight. How different things might have been if he'd just written a ticket and moved on. How many lives would have stayed unchanged? How many connections would have remained unmade? The sound of laughter drew his attention back to the present. The giant was demonstrating a play, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he showed proper footwork to a group of wide-eyed kids. Parents watched from the sidelines, chatting casually with other officers who'd stopped by after their shifts. The scene was so natural now, it was hard to remember a time when it wasn't this way. A small boy tugged at Mitchell's sleeve, pulling him from his thoughts. "Officer, can you help us practice tackles?" he asked eagerly. Mitchell looked at the giant, who gave him an encouraging nod. As he jogged onto the field, Mitchell felt grateful for that night's wrong turn that had led to everything being so right. The sun was setting over Cedar Grove, painting the sky in beautiful colors, but the real beauty was happening on that field. Police officers and kids running plays together. Parents and community leaders working side by side. And in the middle of it all, a giant of a man whose presence had helped transform a town's understanding of what community really meant. 1 year after that fateful traffic stop, Cedar Grove had become a different place. The community center was hosting its first ever Unity Championship, a flag football tournament that brought together teams from all over the county. But this wasn't just any tournament. Each team had to include at least one police officer playing alongside the kids. Officer Mitchell stood at the edge of the field, amazed by the scene before him. The giant was in his element, moving between teams, offering encouragement and tips to nervous players. His massive frame was easy to spot, but it was his laugh that really carried across the field, deep, genuine, and infectious. "Remember when you pulled me over?" the giant asked, walking up to Mitchell. Who would have thought that broken taillight would lead to all this? He gestured at the crowded field, where kids in colorful jerseys were warming up alongside officers in specially made uniformed shirts. Some of the officers Mitchell barely recognized anymore. They'd shed their serious demeanors, replaced by genuine smiles and playful attitudes. The bleachers were packed with families, some from neighborhoods that had once viewed police with suspicion. Now they were cheering just as loudly for the officers as they were for their own kids. The smell of grilled hot dogs and popcorn filled the air, and local businesses had set up booths around the field, turning the tournament into a full-blown community festival. "Hey, coach," a voice called out. Mitchell turned to see one of their regular kids running toward them. A year ago, this same boy would cross the street to avoid police cars. Now he was proudly wearing a jersey with both the police department and community center logos. Are we still doing the special play we practiced? The giant winked at the boy. You bet we are. Just remember what we talked about. It's not about winning or losing. It's about, he paused, letting the boy finish the sentence. About showing people what we can do when we work together. The kid beamed, then ran back to his team, high-fiving an officer along the way. The tournament itself was something special. Kids who'd never played organized sports were making incredible plays. Officers who'd spent years seeing only the tough side of their job were rediscovering joy through these games. The giant moved between fields, his presence like a good luck charm, spreading encouragement and wisdom wherever he went. During a break between games, Mitchell noticed a group of teenagers hanging around the parking lot. A year ago, this might have made him suspicious. But as he watched, he realized they were the same kids who'd vandalized the center that night. Now they were helping younger kids practice their throws, wearing volunteer shirts, and completely invested in making the day special. The mayor showed up around noon, but nobody made a big fuss. He stood in line for hot dogs just like everyone else, chatting with families and taking pictures with kids. Local news crews were there too, but the story they were capturing wasn't about crime statistics or community problems. It was about hope, about what happens when people choose to see the best in each other. As the day went on, something remarkable happened during the games. Nobody seemed to care much about the scores. Kids were more excited about playing alongside officers than winning trophies. Officers were more focused on making sure every kid had fun than making sure rules were strictly followed. The giant had somehow taught them all that some victories don't show up on any scoreboard. Late in the afternoon during the final game, Mitchell found himself playing quarterback. The giant had insisted, even though Mitchell had protested that he'd embarrass himself. But as he looked at his teammates, kids from every background, a mix of cultures and communities, he realized it didn't matter how well he played. What mattered was that he was there, showing up, being part of something bigger than himself. The special play they'd practiced was nothing fancy, just a simple screen pass. But when Mitchell threw the ball to the smallest kid on the team, something magical happened. Officers from both teams pretended to trip, kids created the perfect running lane, and that little boy, who'd once been too scared to even talk to police, scored the final touchdown of the day. The cheers that erupted weren't just for that play. They were for everything that had changed in the past year. For barriers broken down, for trust rebuilt, for a community that had learned to see beyond uniforms and appearances. The giant's thunderous applause could be heard above it all, his joy pure and contagious. As the sun began to set on their first Unity Championship, Mitchell stood with the giant, watching families and officers mingling, sharing stories, and making plans for next year's tournament. You know, the giant said thoughtfully, that broken taillight might have been the best thing that ever happened to this town. Mitchell nodded, thinking about how close he'd come to just writing a ticket that night. How easily this could have been just another routine traffic stop, forgotten by morning. Instead, it had become the start of something extraordinary, proof that sometimes the best endings come from the most unexpected beginnings. The field lights came on, casting a warm glow over the community center. Kids were still playing pickup games, officers were helping clean up, and the sense of unity was almost tangible in the evening air. Cedar Grove had changed, not through any grand plan or official program, but through the simple power of people choosing to see the best in each other one day at a time.